shiur tonight has to do with some clarifications about cosmetics and toiletries for Pesach. There are multiple lists that are issued every single year, and they're becoming more and more sophisticated as different kashrus agencies are more and more sharing information about different medications, cosmetics, and toiletries that are permitted and are not permitted for use or not recommended for use on Pesach. And the question that a person might have, of course, is, what does my roll-on have to do with chametz on Pesach, right? In other words, I'm going to use shampoo, I'm not ingesting it, I'm not eating it, I'm not taking it in. Why should there even be an issue of chametz on Pesach if you're going to tell me that I'm not allowed to be neheneh from chametz on Pesach, but this is not edible chametz, so what's the issue? So I wanted us to take a look at, it's almost like there's the susceptibility to cynicism that can come up when a person comes and says, why is there an OU on my oven cleaner or on my Tide detergent, right? And the answer has been sometimes cynically, well, everyone's going to make a buck, But there is actually more to it than that when it comes to the concern about certain products on Pesach. And so I want us to examine the source material and see what the considerations are. It's also important to know that we're just doing a very skimming of the surface, a very cursory view of what is a very complicated topic. And so it's actually one of the more complicated topics, and we're just trying to simplify it as much as we can. We're just going to touch on a few different points. So let's start with source number one, which is the Gemara in Avodah Zarah, which is actually lengthier than the one line that I'm giving you now, but for our purposes it will suffice. The Brisa says, Lo sochlu kol nevela lager asher bisharecha. The Torah tells us that you're not allowed to eat nevela, which is carrion, right, an animal that dies without shechita, and instead give it to the non-Jew who is in your midst. The ger, meaning the ger toshav, the righteous Gentile, let him give him charity, let him have it instead. The Gemara derives from that pasuk, Kol haruya lager kruya nevela, she'ein ruya lager ein kruya nevela. It has to be edible for a ger in order to be called a nevela. If it's not edible to a ger, then it's not even called nevela, and it's not prohibited for consumption. From here we learn a general principle that something that's no sein tam lifgam, if something contributes to a food system, and it adds negative flavor, it's not, and even if it's from a prohibited substance, that substance does not prohibit. You guys are nodding your head. You've studied this a lot, huh? But in general, it's not even called a nevela. It's not a prohibited substance anymore if it's not edible to a human being. Now, so it seems like the bar that you have to meet in order for something to be prohibited is that it has to be fit for human consumption. Once it's no longer fit for human consumption, it's not considered to be the substance, the original substance anymore, the forbidden substance. And that's really the source of this whole discussion that is much lengthier in the Gemara in Avodah Zarah. The reason I just brought this one line is because we're going to contrast that now with the Gemara in Pesachim. There's actually back-to-back sugyas in the Gemara in Pesachim that are very much related to each other. And we'll just go, it's two brises that are back-to-back in Pesachim Daf Mem Hey Amid Beis. The first one is Tanu Rabbanan. The brisa says, Hapas she'ifsha v'nifsala milecha la'adam. That if bread becomes moldy and it's no longer fit for human consumption, I'm just including the Rashi in the brackets for your convenience. We'll skip the brackets unless we need clarification. V'hakelev yachol la'ochla, but it's still edible that a dog would go ahead and eat it. Mitama atumas ochlin. It still can contract tuma. And like Rashi points out, because as long as it's still edible to a dog, even if it's no longer edible to a human being, it's still called the food item. It still is called the food item. And therefore, like Rashi says, lo paka toras oichel mina, that the status of a food item has not yet left it, and therefore b'kibetza, as long as it is the size of a kibetza, it can become tameh. If it would no longer be a food item, then it couldn't become tameh, as we know. V'nisrefes im hatuma b'pesach. But what you are allowed to do is you're allowed to burn it together with things that are tameh. If this food item is truma, for example, and it's become moldy and no longer edible to human beings, but it's still edible to a dog, you're allowed to actively expose it to tumah. And like Rashi points out, in other words, we're less stringent with the laws of exposing it to tumah. Normally, truma is not allowed to be exposed to tumah, but since it's no longer edible, you're allowed to expose it to tumah. It's still called a food, it still can become tameh, but we don't care if you make it tameh, if it's truma. And Mishum Rabbi Nassan Amru Eina Mitama'a. And Rabbi Nassan disagrees, and he says that something that's no longer edible for human consumption is not even subject to being tameh anymore at all. It's not a food at all. Period. So we have a basic machlokus between Rabbi Nassan and the Chachamim about moldy bread. Okay, let's go on to the next brisa. Tanu Rabban, and the next brisa says, Arevas ha'avdanin. Now, here Rashi tells us what this is. This is a trough that is used by leather makers, by tanners. And what they do, and when the processing of hide, in order to dry out the hide in the processing, what do? You add flour in order to remove the excess moisture in the hide. Okay? Shenasan l'socha kemach, and in this trough, you add flour, and you do this right before Pesach. So then the halacha is toch shlosha yamim chayav leva'er, kodem shlosha yamim eno chayav leva'er. If the flour was added within 3 days of Pesach, so then you have to clean out the trough before Pesach. But if you added the flour further away than 3 days, more than 3 days earlier than Pesach, you added it 4 days before Pesach, 5 days before Pesach, so then you're not obligated to clean out the trough before Pesach. And the reason that Rashi tells us is that kvar niskalkala al yedei reach hakli. That flour is totally messed up. You know, if it's been in there for 3 days or more before Pesach, you have nothing to worry about. And that's true, explains Rashi, Afal pi shelo nasan l'socha oros, even if it's before you put any hides in there, which will certainly remove any edibility from the flour, just putting it in this smelly tanner's trough with all the other chemicals is enough to ruin the flour. And Amar Rabbi Nassan, b'medvar mamurim shelo nasan l'socha oros, aval nasan l'socha oros afilu toch shlosha eino chayiv levayer. And Reb Nassan is even more makel, and he says that you could even add flour within 3 days of Pesach as long as there's hides in there that are tanning. Because once the flour hits the hides, even for a small moment, it really becomes nifsal me'achila. It becomes no longer edible. It's totally yucky, right? And no one's going to want to eat it. And therefore you don't have to clean the trough out at all. Even as long as there are hides in there, you don't have to clean out the trough, even if you added it a day before Pesach, even an hour before Pesach. Okay, or the zman, of biur. Okay, so this should raise alarms. Really, it's the first part that should raise sort of an alarm, and that is that the Gemara in Avodah Zarah had told us that once something is no longer edible to the ger, which is a human being, it's no longer considered to be a food item. You contrast this with the Gemara in Pesachim, and it seems to be saying, at least according to the Chachamim, that once something is nifsal me'achilas kelev, if it's no longer edible to a dog, then it's no longer a food item. But if it's still edible to a dog, then it's still called a food item. Well, okay, so you could argue that it's only legabe tuma, right? You could. All right, so let's see what the Ran says. So the Ran in Pesachim on Daf Memhei, which is really going to be a very pivotal Ran, which the poskim all pick up on, he says as follows, source number 3. Pas she'ifsha v'nifsla milecha la'adam v'nisrefesim hatuma b'pesach. So the Ran says as follows, Perush. Afal gav de nevela she'ena ru'uya leger lo shma nevela, that even though once carrion is no longer edible to a human being, it's no longer called nevela. V'no sein tam lifgam shari afilu b'chametz b'pesach. And we know that if something is chametz and it adds a negative flavor, it adds a flavor that is undesirable, that is not food related, then that's true even on Pesach, that no sein tam lifgam is mutter, that if it adds a bad flavor, it's not considered to be flavor at all. He says, but over here it's different. And I'll tell you why. He says anything that has the ability to leaven other things, even if it is no longer considered edible, still has a problem, has the stigma of chametz. Okay, so as long as it can be a leavening agent, then even if it itself is not edible, it still is a problem of chametz on Pesach. And that's really actually a very sort of crucial concept that will act as a foundational idea for our understanding of a lot of different halachas on Pesach. And he says, and he says, to wit, yeast is not edible, right? Yeast is not edible. You know, no one's going to sit down for yeast, right? And yet the Torah still forbids yeast. The Mechilta actually, which is the Midrash, actually speaks this out quite explicitly. It says, Ki kol ochel machmetzes v'nichrisa. The Torah says that if you eat a leavening agent, you will get kares. Lama nemar. So why was it necessary, the Mechilta asks, for the Torah to write that pasuk? Lefishu hu omer ki kol ochel chametz, ein li ela shechayavenu lav kares. So, or minayin tamal omer ki kol ochel machmetzes. Because the Torah only prohibits and provides an isser of kares for someone who eats chametz. But how do you know that something that's not itself chametz but leavens other things, that it's also included? That's why you need the second pasuk. Ad shelo yomar yesh li bedin. Because before the Torah says that, I could have made a logical argument, which goes as follows. Ma im chametz she'enu mechametz acherim chayovan olav kares, so or shuhu machmetz lacherim and edin shchayav olav kares. I could have made a logical argument that maybe it's not necessary for the Torah to write that yeast brings kares, because if after all something which is leavened by yeast brings an isser kares, surely the yeast itself should provide kares. Says the Mechilta, lo. Im amart b'chametz shu roi lachila tomer bisor she'enu roi lachila. Tamalomer ki kol ochel machmetzes. No, you can't say that, because on the other hand, chametz is edible. Yeast is not edible. And therefore you need a separate pasuk to tell you that despite its inedibility, it still brings you kares if you ingest it on Pesach. Okay, so that's the rule, and that's the reason why, explains the Ran, that we're more machmir by inedible products on Pesach than we are during the rest of the year. It may be inedible for human consumption, but still, as long as it's edible to a dog, still has the status of a food item, to the point where, just like a dog would consume yeast, a dog can consume other moldy bread. Why? And why is that a problem, despite its inedibility? Because I can use it to leaven other items. So it's a leavening agent, and it's usher because it's a leavening agent, not because it's a food item. Even though Rashi says it's still a food item, but it's a food item vis-a-vis the fact that it's included in the Torah's prohibition of yeast. But it's still inedible to human beings. Okay. So how does this translate into the Shulchan Aruch? So we'll quickly go through the Shulchan Aruch in 3 different sifim in the Shulchan Aruch. In Siman Tov Mem Beis. So in Siman Tov Mem Beis Sif Aleph, the Shulchan Aruch says, Tarovis chametz over malav mishum bal yero bal yimotze, that even something that is not pure chametz, but it is a mixture of different foods that have chametz in them, there is a prohibition that you violate the Torah by having it in your possession. Kugon hamurias v'kusa chababli v'sheichar hamodi v'chol kayotze ve'elu midevarim hane'echalim. Such as murias, which is like a fish brine that has, sometimes they add chametz to it. Kuta chababli is this really wicked sour milk with moldy breadcrumbs mixture, which sounds just absolutely delicious. We even find during the times of the Gemara that only the Babylonians could stomach it. The Palestinian Jews really couldn't stand it. Anyway, the Sheikhar Hamadi and this type of beer, okay? Anyway, all of these kinds of things are prohibited midioraisa on Pesach. Aval davar sheyesh bo tarovis chametz ve'einu roi lachila. But if something has a mixture of chametz in it and it's no longer edible, mutter l'kayamo b'Pesach. There's no problem of having it in your home on Pesach, which seems tantamount to the fact that you're allowed to derive benefit from it, even though you're not allowed to consume it. Kigo, such as arei basa avdadim shenosan l'socho kemach ba'oros. And here's the example of the Gemara, that tanner's trough that has flour in it. Even if you put the flour in 1 hour before the Isser of the Zman of the Isser of Chametz and Erev Pesach arrives, you're still allowed to keep it. It's no problem because the flour has been rendered inedible. If you didn't put hides in it, this is like Rav Nassan had said, then just putting it into that stinky chemical container, even without the hides, as long as it's 3 days in advance of Pesach, by 3 days the flour has deteriorated. And therefore, but if it's within 3 days, chayev levayer, then you have to clean it out. V'chein hakilor v'haretiya v'aspelonis v'hatariaka shenasan l'socho chametz mutter l'kaim v'pesach shri nifsad suras hachametz. All of these other things are types of bandages or medications that have chametz in them. You're allowed to keep them. You're allowed to have them in your possession on Pesach. There's no isser bal yirah bal yimotzei, because they no longer have the original form of the chametz. And it seems also that these things, even though they're still asur ba'achila, you're not allowed to ingest them, but you would be allowed to benefit from them in some way, and we'll talk about that shortly. And then in Sif Beis we have the next case from Daf Mem Hey. Hapas atzma she'if shavenipsala milechol hakela. Here you have no longer a tarobis chametz, you have actual chametz itself in its pure form, which is bread, but it's gone moldy, and it's no longer edible to a dog. Umalugma shenisracha, or if it's a type of bandage which is just pure chametz, and it becomes rotten, it goes bad. Eino chayiv levar, you don't have to destroy that. Okay? But here you notice that he says explicitly, the Mechaber, that it's nifsla milechol hakeleb, that a dog can no longer eat it. In Sif Aleph, I don't believe he said that it was nifsla milechol hakeleb, and we'll talk about that shortly. Sif Tes almost seems to be a repetition of Sif Beis, and it's a little bit tzarachian why the Mechaber had to have two different seifim for seemingly saying the same thing. That's not a discussion for now, but if you can detect certain subtle differences, let me know. Chametz, he says, shenis afesh. Kodem zman yisuru v'nifsal me'achila sakela. If the chametz, here he talks about, Sif Beis was pas, and here he's talking about chametz, which is a more generic term. Anything that's chametz that goes rotten or spoils before the time that it's asur, and it's no longer edible to a dog, o shesarfo ba'esh, or if it was burned in a fire kodem zmano, before the zman of isur, like you do bir chametz and you burn your bagels to a charcoal, so the point where it's no longer edible to a dog, or let's say you take a slab of dough and you say, I'm going to use this no longer for consumption, but I'm going to use this as a piece of furniture, and you plaster over it, like Play-Doh. You could take Play-Doh and use it, and then, or any dough that's made with flour, and then plaster over it, rendering it inedible and designating it as a toy or a piece of furniture. So then, mutter l'kaima b'Pesach, it's no problem, you're allowed to have that in your possession on Pesach. So comes along the Mishnah Berurah, and he says this, actually the Mishnah Berurah says this multiple times. And the Mishnah Berurah says in Sivkat and Lametes, he says, Kodem zman yisuro v'nifsal, if it becomes inedible before the period of when chametz is asur, he says it is absolutely necessary for it to become inedible even to a dog before the zman, that chametz is asur. Because if it's only inedible for human consumption, and only on Pesach it becomes inedible to a dog, so a dog would have eaten it before Pesach, and only now it becomes even worse. Just the Mishnah Berurah points out that, you got to make sure that it's mamish, not even edible for a dog. So, the Bir Halacha in source number 6, which we won't go through, it's just a one-liner, but basically he says, Apol gav the bishari certain kol shenaroi lachilas adam muter. He says, he speaks out the Ran, which is quoted by the Magen Avram in the Bir Halacha. He says, even though when it comes to other prohibited foodstuffs, once it becomes inedible for human consumption, there's no longer any prohibition. He says, shiny chametz. Chametz is different. Shafilu eino roi lachilas adam roi lachametz bo isos acheros. But chametz is different because it can be used as a leavening agent. And as long as it can be used as a leavening agent, then it's really going to be an issue. So I want you to consider for a second, start thinking about how to apply this to modern day chemicals or alcohol and things like that that are made from chametz. The only reason why it has to be nifsal me'achilas kelev is because, in theory, you could use an ingredient that has leaven in it to leaven other things. So just consider then that if something is so chemically altered that it could not be used to leaven other things, then as long as it's nifsal me'achilas adam, it's perfectly fine. That's really an important yesod. Okay, the Chazon Ish points out that when we go to our case of the tanner's example, the Chazon Ish just wants to make an interesting observation. You know, the Chazon Ish has this commentary on the Rambam. So first he quotes the Rambam in source number 7. He quotes him from Perek Daled Mehilchos Chametz, Halacha, I think it's Halacha Ches, Aval Davar, or Halacha Hey, it's hard to read. He says, Aval Davar sheyesh bo taroves Chametz ve'eno roi lachila. He says, the Rambam writes that something that is a combination of chametz and other items, and it's no longer edible plain, doesn't say whether it's edible to a human or a dog, hareza mutter l'kaimo b'Pesach. You're allowed to keep it in your possession on Pesach. Hi, eno roi la'achila, that's the end of the Rambam. So the Chazon Ish just wants to clarify that when the Rambam says it's not edible, you're allowed to keep it in your possession on Pesach, hainu la'achilas adam. All the Rambam means is that it's no longer edible for human consumption. He says, "Ba'afal gav de pas she'ifsha u'ru'uya lekelev chayev levayer ch'moshe kosav Rabbeinu halacha yud aleph." Why is it any different from moldy bread? Moldy bread has to be inedible to dogs. Why is the flour that you put in the tanner's trough only need to be inedible for humans? Why doesn't it have to be inedible for dogs as well? So he answers, he says, Hasam mishum deru'uya l'shocher k'da amar b'gemar mem hey amad beis. For the very simple reason is that you could take moldy bread, grind it up into flour, into yeast particles, or like moldy bread particles, which is essentially yeast. And you could use that as a leavening agent for the future. However, but once you mix flour in something disgusting that chemically alters it or makes it bitter and inedible, in this way with the tanner's trough rather, once it's no longer usable, it's not edible for humans, it cannot be used as a leavening agent, and therefore it's completely bottle, and you don't have to worry about it. And that's why it doesn't have to be inedible to a dog. As long as it's inedible for humans, it's no longer poses a problem on Pesach, and you can have it. You can have it on Pesach, not to ingest perhaps, but at least you can keep it in your home and you can benefit from it. Fine, okay. That's an important proviso. It certainly fits in logically with everything that we've seen before. Okay, yes?
This concept of a dog eating it, is it any a normal dog?
Is it any dog, or is it, well, you know, the dog on the Alpo commercial, or the, you know, with the Gainsburgers or whatever, I don't even know what they're serving. Yeah, remember Gainsburgers?
Yeah, sure.
They still make those? I don't even know. There's a problem, by the way, with Gainsburgers, because it's not only chametz, it's basar b'chalav sometimes, you know. Be careful about those things. No, seriously, because you're not allowed to benefit from basar b'chalav. Dog food, it poses a unique challenge. You're not allowed to benefit from chametz on Pesach, but you're also not allowed to benefit from tarovis, a mixture of basar and chalav, even for your dog. You have to actually check the ingredients on your dog and cat food to make sure that there's no mixture of dairy and meat ingredients in your dog and cat food.
John would be very happy.
Do you wish you didn't come tonight?
No, I can't stand. No, my kid's making me crazy to get a pet. This is all the reason not to.
No. Dogs are nice. Cats I wouldn't get. Anyway, so I'm not a cat lover.
Couldn't tell.
But anyway, so the answer is, to answer your question, it's not just any old dog. As a matter of fact, there are many poskim who say that you can't sort of do a taste test and bring over Fido and ask him to taste the food and see if Fido's not going to eat it, then obviously it's nefsol me'achilas kela. It doesn't always work that way. What if Fido is a very fastidious dog and he's brought up on Alpo and schnitzel, right, or whatever, right? So it has to be a very hungry dog, and it's not so easy to make that determination. But the Chazal, we're not talking about the dogs that you kept in your home. Chazal, we're talking about street dogs that would rummage through a rubble in the street to find the most disgusting things, like lahavdil, the cats that you find in Israel today rummaging through the garbage. That probably would be a good test. Okay, so that's where we are at this point. Bottom line is that on Pesach we require chametz to be nifsal me'achilas kelev in order for it to no longer present a problem of actually keeping it on Pesach or benefiting from it on Pesach. And it has to be nifsal me'achilas kelev from before the Zman of Isser, from before Erev Pesach. And if it's no longer has the ability to act as a leavening agent, like the Chazon Ish pointed out, then all you require is for it to be nifsal me'achilas adam. It just has to be inedible to human beings. That's the first part of this discussion. The next part of the discussion is a Gemara in Maseches Nida, Daf Lamed Beis. The Gemara says, Tanya, V'lo yechalalu es kodshei v'nei Yisrael asher yorimu lashem. The Brisa quotes a pasuk having to do with Truma, and the pasuk says that the Jewish people may not profane the holy things of the Jewish people, that which they tithe for God. So what is it? So the Brisa wants to know, what does it mean to profane something, to take it for personal use? So explains the Gemara, L'rabos es hasach ve'es hashoseh. This comes to teach me that even anointing yourself with truma oil, if you're a Yisrael, is prohibited. Okay? So therefore, and if you drink that truma item, you're also in violation of the law. So it's not just eating, it's anointing and drinking as well. So asks the Gemara, Shosa lamali kra shesiya bichlal achila. So what do you mean? You need a special pasuk to add also not only anointing yourself, but also drinking. Drinking is tantamount to eating. You don't need a separate psukim to prohibit drinking. Drinking is part of the eating process. So the Gemara answers, Elo l'rabos es hasach kishosa. Answers the Gemara, it's coming to tell you, you're right. This pasuk is only needed to tell me that anointing myself, putting a lotion on my body that's made from truma, is prohibited, and it's tantamount to my drinking it. It's tantamount to my drinking it. And the Ibai Seima Mehacha, alternatively, another pasuk that would indicate that is Vatavo Kamayim Bikirbo Ucheshemen Ba'atzmosav, that it comes like water in his innards and like oil being anointed on his bones. Now this is a pasuk from Nach, and this pasuk from Nach tells me that smearing lotions or oils on your flesh, on your bones, is like drinking something. Now, the question, of course, is, it's very unusual for us to find the Gemara which quotes a pasuk that's from the Torah, and then says, alternatively, you have another pasuk in Nach. That seems very strange. Is there an Isser Dioraisa of anointing oneself? If so, just use the pasuk from the Torah and don't bring in a pasuk from Nach. So Tosfos on that daf explains a very important principle. He says, we're not going through the whole Tosfos, but he says, V'omer Rabbeinu Tam, in source number 9, Dekra de lo yechalalu nami asmachtahu. He says, you have to say, based on this Gemara, that this is not a real biblical teaching. This is not a biblical precept that anointing is tantamount to drinking. it's only a rabbinical ordinance. It's only a derabbanan. And Tosfos demonstrates that from a number of different sources, and therefore, V'od Omar Rabbeinu Tam. If you skip down another 3 lines, he says, and furthermore, Rabbeinu Tam says, the dafka sichas shemen asmechucha rabbanan akra va'asr midrabbanan. That the only thing that is prohibited rabbinically is anointing oneself with fragrant oils that are prohibited, that the oil itself is a forbidden substance. Aval sicha shel shuman chazir v'shel chelev sharia. But anointing yourself with the oil of a pig oil, which I never heard of before this Tosfos, but I guess that was a byproduct of pig. What do they call this? Tallow is lard. Lard. That's what lard is, right? Exactly. If you take lard and you turn it into some kind of cosmetic product, a toiletry product, I'm sure somewhere they probably figured how to do this, somewhere in Louisiana probably. So, or vishal chelev, or if you take tallow or some kind of forbidden fat from a kosher animal, but it's chelev, it's forbidden, and it's asr bahana, sharia, then there's not even a rabbinic prohibition. Uveper kol shah omar haminiach chelev shel shor haniska lagabi makaso pater avol asr, hu mishum da asr bahana. Mashma avol chelev da alma filu isur aleka. He says, even though the Gemara in Pesachim says that if you anoint yourself, or if you place the fat of a shor that is supposed to be executed, because for a number of different reasons, it was used, let's say, for avodah zarah, you have to put that animal to death. Because if you take some of its fat and you use that as a salve or an ointment for your wound, that's asr. So you see from here that it's only when the animal is mamish asr bahana. But let's say you're allowed to get hana from a forbidden substance, and it's not the oil from truma, so then there's absolutely, even though the substance itself is prohibited for ingestion because it's chelev or it's lard, nevertheless, you're allowed to use it as a salve, even lechatchila, says Tosfos. Now, think about this. Think about a forbidden substance on Pesach, which is, of course, something that's made out of chametz. It would seem from Tosfos that it would be perfectly legit for you to take a chametz substance and use it as a salve, as long as there's no isser hana on that chametz. Now, how do we, even though we know that chametz is asr bahana, but there are certain kinds of chametz that are not asr bahana. What types of chametz are not asr bahana? Inedible types of chametz. They may be asr ba'achila, but they're not asr bahana because they're inedible. And to what degree is there inedibility? So either they have to be nifsal me'achilas kelev because they can leaven other products, or they have to be, if they're incapable of leavening other products, they have to be nifsal me'achilas adam. They have to be inedible to human beings. Once you rise to that level of inedibility, so, right? Rise, okay. Oh, man. All right, so then you're allowed to use these things as ointments for your body, according to Tosfos.
Does Tosfos deal with achshaveh?
Does he deal with achshaveh?
In other words, by hano, so he's giving a reason that that would seemingly look like you would be able to do it because you have no hano, you're not having achila.
Right.
How do you deal with to you it's obviously something that's important.
To you it's important. Well, all of the examples that the Gemara gave are things that a person says are, Tosfos himself gives these examples of things that are important. I'm not sure whether achshaveh is a factor here. It may be that it is discussed by some of the poskim. But what you're referring to is sometimes when you yourself designate something as a food item, then it rises to the level. But here you're not designating it as a food item. You're designating it as a lotion. So maybe that's different. Maybe that's why it's not a problem.
Or you just consider Rabbi Adam as opposed to individuals.
What's that?
If it's Rabbi Adam, I guess maybe it's defined by what Rabbi Adam would consider.
What Rabbi Adam, yeah. Okay. let's go on one more. So that's part number 2. So we've seen part number 1 is that if it's nifsal me'achila, it's not edible anymore, then there's no problem in having it in your possession on Pesach, and you can get hana from it. Now, part number 2, anointing yourself with something that's usher is only a rabbinical prohibition at times, but it would seem that with any prohibition other than anointing oil of truma, it's not even a rabbinical prohibition whatsoever, according to this Rabbeinu Tam. There's part number 3 now. Part number 3 now is going to throw a wrench in a lot of these discussions, and there are a lot of textual sources for this part number 3. But I want you to turn to the last page of our source sheet for an essay from Rav Tzvi Pesach Frank, which is from Mikroi Kodesh, volume 1 of Pesach, Siman Nun Daled, and he presents the following issue: Spirit shenifsal l'shasiya al yedei ra'al. What does this mean? An alcoholic liquid, alcohol, spirit, alcohol, that is rendered inedible through some kind of poison or bitter agent. What do we call that? Denatured alcohol. Okay. So he tells us the following shaila: Nishalti al derech haspirtos shel chametz. He says, I was asked the following question. There's a certain kind of chametz alcohol, because it's made from grain, presumably, okay? Sheyesh meches, yes?
Nowadays it's probably grape source.
I beg your pardon?
Alcohol now, commercially, is probably grape source now.
Grape.
Yeah, it used to be from grain. Now they're just, I haven't looked it up in a few years, quite a few years, but now it's grape.
Weren't they making it out of other products, out of petroleum?
Well, you could. There's a company in Quebec that makes out of wood chips, so it's good to use for Pesach.
Yeah.
But I spent a few years checked on this. There's an excess of grapes in the world.
I see. Okay, that's very interesting. Okay, so anyway, let's see what the situation is over here. He tells us a very interesting historical issue. He says, "Sheyesh meches rak al hamiyuchad l'shasiya." He says, why was alcohol denatured in the first place? In the Middle East, it was denatured because they used to charge a tax on spirits that you would have to import into Israel. Avol hamiyuchad l'sereifa ein olav tashlum meches. But if it's only alcohol that's usable for fuel, for let's say lighting your kerosene lamp, so there's no spirits tax.
It's methyl poisons.
Because
alcohol used for lighting is methyl poisons.
So hold on a second. But hold on a second. You can actually take edible alcohol and use it as a fuel source also. So what did people do? So he's going to tell you. He says, "Uchedei lahavtiach shelo yishtamshu bespiritos rak l'sreifa." So the authorities do the following. They want to make sure that in order to avoid the tariff on these imported alcoholic liquids, they want to make sure that they can't be consumed, they can't be drunk, and therefore ma'arvin shluchei hamemshala haturkit sam shemekalkel hatam v'gam yesh lo reach ra. What they do is they add a certain kind of poison to the alcohol that normally would be drinkable. It's drinkable alcohol, but they denature it. What does it mean they denature it? They add a very foul-smelling chemical that's also poisonous to prevent people from drinking it. And in this way, not only do they prevent people from getting shikar and buying alcohol cheaply, but they can also avoid having the tariff being assessed on this import. Okay?
Yeah, they still denature it. In fact, to get pure alcohol, it's only someone like myself can sign for it and to get pure. If you want to recompounding.
Right. So this is in the times of the Ottoman Turks.
Ontario, Quebec might be different. They're very lenient there.
Okay. So this is very interesting. Okay. So ba'ofen she'yev shelishtoso klal. And so therefore it becomes totally undrinkable. So the question therefore is, v'hashe'elahi, can you use this alcohol as a fuel source on Pesach? Apparently they had stoves that were fueled by this type of kerosene or alcohol, and this is where. So this is not a methyl. What did you call it?
Methyl alcohol, wood alcohol, wood grade.
That's
This was not a methyl alcohol. This is ethyl, which was denatured. Yes. Okay. Great. Okay. Good. So he writes as follows. He says, "L'cha'ora mekivan sheniskalkel v'nichgam mishitia kodem zmani yisuro." So on the one hand, since it has been rendered inedible before the zman of this, or before Pesach, havi kecharcho kodem zmano deshori bahana. This is like what the Shulchan Aruch talks about, which you burn a bagel to a piece of charcoal, and therefore it's completely mutter bahana. You can get benefit from it. You can keep it in your home, get benefit from it, and whatever. However, here's an interesting wrench. Aval matzasi b'shut shoyelo meishiv. I looked in the following Tshuva Sefer, and he writes, Yekosav, he says, "De bishlama im nehene al yedei achila u'shasiya shayach lefagem." He says, if the benefit that you're getting from this alcohol or chametz source is through eating or through drinking, and you make it pagum, so then we could understand how, if you're benefiting from it in that fashion, that's not called real benefit. And therefore, making it pagum from achila and shatiya now allows you to benefit from it in an achila ushtiya fashion. But the Sholem Eshiv says that the very fact that you're getting a different benefit from it, other than eating or drinking, means that the fact that you've denatured it from its edibility state is irrelevant. He says, and Rabbi Tzvi Pesach says, I really don't get it. I mean, I don't understand what kind of distinction he's drawing, but the distinction he's making, I didn't look into the tshuva of the Sholem Eshiv myself, but that certainly would make for an interesting further research project to see what exactly is he talking about. His argument is that the very fact that you want to make it into something that is not for achila, you want to make it into a fuel, and therefore you're going to benefit from it in a way that's totally different from achila shtiya, that in itself is a reason to say that it's aser, because it's a new hana, it's not a food hana, it's a different kind of hana, and therefore chametz is still going to be in its aser state. And you can't, the only time that you can get hana from chametz that's no longer edible is if you're getting a hana through ingestion. So therefore, okay, it's one thing if you added this item, let's say, to something that would give you some kind of benefit through eating and drinking, or maybe even if you were to argue that anointing yourself with a lotion is like eating. That's mela, that you could get benefit from. But to use it as a fuel, because that's a totally different genre of benefit, it's like outside the playing field, and therefore it's going to still be usser.
Perhaps that was his intent.
That was your intent when you made it pago. And since that was the whole intent, that it doesn't work. And so remember, Tzvi Pesach has a problem with it. He doesn't really understand why that should be a problem. And then he goes and he says, "V'yu'im b'shut mahari asad, shamater mehaytaim ala ashin b'titon." He says the Mahari Asad, who's a 19th century posek, he writes that for this reason it's permitted to smoke, I think Titon is a type of cigar. A Titan, is there such a cigar called a Titan? I'm not sure. Titon, as they translate it, is titanium, or a Titan. Shekosef Hamogin Avram, the Siman Tov Samach Zayin Sid Kudyal Yud, the Tabak Derech L'Sharosa B'Shecher, that what they used to do with tobacco is they used to soak it in beer. Don't ask me why. Okay, I don't know if they do that today anymore.
They have sherry
flavored
cigars.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Just flavored cold
flavored cigars. Okay. Okay, knock yourself out. Bezel Lashon Hagon Beis Meir, and so this is the tshuva from the Beis Meir who writes that Kosav Achoy Yankiv B'Shem Magen Avram Tabak Derech L'Shrosa B'Shecher V'Tzarech L'Sagro B'Cheder. That he quotes from the Magen Avram that if you have tobacco that's been soaked in chametz alcohol, that you have to seal it off for Pesach. He says, "L'daiti lo yehekein, lo gara mehasha v'simin tov min beis sif testa mutter b'hana mishum decharcho kodem zmano." He says, but I disagree, says the Beis Meir. He says, I feel that once it's been rendered completely inedible, then there's nothing wrong with smoking a cigar. Put that in your pipe and smoke it, right? He says there's nothing wrong with it, and so you see that even though this is not an achila shatia kind of benefit, it's a smoking benefit, that you're benefiting it through burning it, you see very clearly that this is part of that this would disagree with the previous tshuva of the Shalom Meshiv. And you can get benefit once it's rendered inedible by soaking in tobacco, so then it's perfectly fine to benefit from it on Pesach. Okay. Umikol hani poskim, skipping to the next paragraph. Mavur sheheter hana michamit shecharcho kodem zmanu hu lo rak al yedei achilu shtia elagam b'shar hanos. And therefore he says clearly it's not like the Sholem Meshiv, and you are allowed to benefit from chametz that's rendered completely inedible before Pesach. And then he writes another very important issue, and he says shuv hisponanti da al yedei chemikalim efshar lahafridas hadavar hapogem hamu'urav v'hashpirtos yachzor v'yehi naki kiva rishona v'yehi ra'ui l'shasiya. Here's another factor. He says denatured alcohol can be renatured. Is that possible?
Yeah, it's possible. It's a lot of trouble.
It's a lot of trouble, but you'd be surprised at how much trouble an alcoholic will go to in order to get to.
Well, you're bypassing the tax. That's the key.
Right. Or you're bypassing the tax, or you're a wino who really needs a hit, needs a fix. Right. So it is possible using some kind of chemical reaction. You can separate the poison from the alcohol, and you can distill it again and give it make it consumable again. So he says, if that's the case, v'imkein yesh ladun da'aser bahana v'gam mechuyev levaro v'ula yavor gam b'bal yeroya. He says, if that's the case, then we have to consider now, is this denatured alcohol considered to be real alcohol, in which case not only am I not allowed to consume it or burn it, I wouldn't even be allowed to have it in my possession on Pesach, and if I do, I might even violate an Isser D'Oraisa of Bal Yeroya. V'yu'uyin b'chavos das, and by the way, this is for you guys studying in the Smicha, they should be holding right around Siman Kuf Gimel. Are you past Kuf Gimel already?
Okay.
Did you see the Chavos Das in Kuf Gimel?
Okay.
He says it's in Kuf Gimel. It's Chavos Das, Kuf Gimel, Sif, Kat, and Aleph. It's in the Biurim, in the Chavos Das. So you'll take a look over there, but he talks about Nosein Tam Lifgam. Le'inyan nisrach b'chazar v'nishbach. What about the halacha of something that becomes putrid, inedible, and then it becomes edible once again? Something that becomes pogum, like we learned before, if a nevela becomes no longer edible, it's no longer nevela. So what would happen if, in theory, a nevela became inedible, and through some process it became edible again? So what would be its status? Would it be nevela again? Or is it now like panim chadashos ba'u lekan? It's something totally new and it's not nevela anymore. Like, for example, if you took a piece of bacon and you totally denatured it, and then somehow you were able to reconstitute it and make it edible again. Is that still bacon or not? So he writes, he says, Shemachalek bazeh bein im guf ha'isr nisrach ve'haheter hu mishum nevela she'en ru'ui lager. So the Chavos Das has a very interesting distinction. He says it depends on how it was rendered inedible. If the actual substance, the bacon, right, was itself rendered inedible because it went completely bad, and you found a way to restore it to its original state, so then sha'az paka shem ha'isr va'afilu chazer v'tikno b'dvar ha'metavlim shari dekvar porach ha'isr minei. Then the bacon will become permitted. It's not bacon anymore. It's not nevela anymore. It's not a forbidden substance, and taka, you could eat bacon. However, but if, let's say, the reason why it was rendered inedible was because you introduced a foreign agent which tainted the flavor of the item, which is like our denatured alcohol example. He says, then if you render it edible again by removing the bitterness or removing the poison, so then it's still the same prohibited substance. So if you eat the denatured alcohol in its denatured state, you're not in violation of a Torah prohibition because you're eating something that's not edible. And in order to be liable, mid'oraisa, you have to consume something that's edible. But if you renature it after you've denatured it by removing the poison, so then taka, since it was only denatured through a foreign substance, it's the same good alcohol that was added, had poison added to it, and if you remove the poison, it's still the same good alcohol. So then the Chavas Da'as says that you really have a serious problem. You have a serious problem that this thing is chametz. So we've seen now two new issues from the Reb Tzvi Pesach. Number one is that he wants to very carefully clarify that once you've rendered something inedible, you can get benefit from it, even if it's not a benefit of eating, but rather a benefit of something else, like burning it, or doing something else with it, using it as fuel, smoking it, and so forth. But point number two, this is a very serious issue that we have to concern ourselves with, is if something has been denatured, but it can be renatured, it can be made re-edible, so then potentially, even in its inedible state, I'm not allowed to keep it in my possession on Pesach, nor certainly get benefit from it. So now let's consider that and talk about how that will affect certain cosmetics and toiletries that I have in my possession that are made from denatured alcohol. What we're going to do is we're going to skip the tshuva from Rav Moshe because of time constraints, but I just refer you to Rav Moshe, who talks about the same idea of the ability to renature alcohol and the potential problems thereby. He also talks about this whole idea of sicha, of anointing yourself with something, right? And Rav Moshe says basically, Rav Moshe's conclusion is that if it's a medication that's made from chametz, then there's surely no problem for even a chola she'ein bo sakana, for someone who needs it for medical purposes, even if it doesn't present a life-threatening condition. But let's say a person has psoriasis, right? And the only medication that they can use to heal the psoriasis is with this cream that has denatured alcohol or some other chametz product in it that's inedible. Then Rav Moshe says, based on the Tosfos that we saw, that that anointing yourself with a forbidden substance is perfectly permitted, right? It says even if you could argue that you could renature the contents of the chametz contents of this ointment, it's still not going to be a problem. But he's only prepared to be matir it for a chola, for a person who has some kind of medical condition. But stamazoi, for any person, Rav Moshe was not prepared to do. Okay, with all of this together, now you have enough background, at least from now you've got all of this great Talmudic knowledge. Now let's look at some of the Pesach guides that are currently available out there. There are slight nuances of difference in the different Pesach guides. You have source number 12, you have the core Pesach guide. But I wanted, and you can go through that yourself, I'm sure you've got it already. But I wanted to show you my chaver of David Heber from the Star K in source number 11, goes through, I think, a little bit more comprehensively what the issues are. And he writes as follows. He says, Lahalacha, all non-food items not fit for canine consumption, which he says, nifsal me'achilas kelev, i.e. something that one would not feed his dog, may be used on Pesach. This includes all cosmetics, soaps, ointments, and creams. And that's the psak. By the way, that's the OU's psak. The OU says, if it's not edible to a dog, even though you could potentially renature it, like what Tzvi Pesach had brought in, don't worry about it. It's completely mutter. The OU has a policy that you don't have to go through with a list going to the supermarket. You can just buy whatever shampoos, creams, ointments, cosmetics you want. It's no problem. Yes?
If you have a deodorant that has a little bit of alcohol in it,
I'm going to get there in a minute.
I was going to say, there's not enough in there to re-distill, if you had a gallon or a drum, maybe you do it. But there's not enough in there. By the time you're finished, there's nothing, you can't do it.
I understand. Okay. However, below are several reasons. He says, nonetheless, people have acted stringently with regard to these items. And he writes as follows. Below are several reasons why people are strict. Number one, many products, including shaving lotion and perfume, contain denatured alcohol, which can be restored to regular alcohol. According to most opinions, one should not use such products on Pesach. The list notes products which do not use chametz-based alcohols. He's referring to a list that Rabbi Bess in LA provides for anyone who's interested, and it gives you a list of cosmetics and products that do not contain this type of denatured grain alcohol. Number 2, and this we did not see inside, but we have enough information to appreciate it. He says the Bir Halacha writes in the name of the Gra that one should be strict and not use non-kosher soap all year. Why? Because the Gra is machmir, unlike Rabbeinu Tam. Rabbeinu Tam, that sicha is not like shtia, but the Gra says you should be machmir and treat sicha, anointing yourself with something, is like drinking. And therefore the Gra says you shouldn't even use non-kosher soap. Now, no one holds like the Gra. I mean, not that I'm aware. Maybe there are people that do, but it's such a chumrah that really he says, although we are not accustomed to this stringency, many individuals have adopted this chumrah during Pesach and do not permit the use of chametz items, even if they are used externally. Number 3, some are of the opinion that we do not say nifsal, unfit for canine consumption, applies to an item that is initially produced as a non-food item. We saw that from the Sholem Eshiv, right? From the Sugya Pesach Frank, since it was initially produced for the purpose of having some hana that's not food related, so then it presents another problem. Now here's another very important issue, which is lipstick. Number 4. Lipstick is often inadvertently ingested when eating food. If it contains chametz, it is halachically permissible to apply it to the lips, since the lipstick is unfit for canine consumption. Nevertheless, most women prefer not to consume even a trace of anything prohibited. The Pesach list provides chametz-free lipsticks. And it's certainly sensible, right, to say that anything that's going to go near the mouth, even if a person wishes to be lenient, which he has every right to do so, the Rabbi Heber is acknowledging you can certainly be lenient. These are chumras. But things that go by the mouth, right, you want to avoid. And 5, mouthwash and toothpaste contain sorbitol and other ingredients which may be derived from chametz. Although lahalacha, these items are permissible to use since they are nifsal me'achilas kelev, many prefer not to use them as they are taken orally. And that's the same idea as we had by lipstick. And I think that's a very sensible position. Make sure that the toothpaste you're using and the mouthwash that you're using does not contain any denatured alcohol. And number 6, historically, it has been the custom to follow stringent opinions regarding Hilchos Pesach. In addition, it seems to have been a prevalent custom to restrict the use of items which may contain chametz, even when they are clearly nifsal me'achilas kelev. Okay. The CRC in Chicago is a little bit more makel. For this year, they issued a letter signed by the poskim of the CRC, which says that all varieties of blush, body soap, conditioners, creams, eyeshadow, eyeliner, face powder, foot powder, foundations, ink, is that what it says? Lotions, mascara, nail polish, ointments, paint, shampoo, and stick deodorant are permitted for use on Pesach, regardless of the ingredients contained within them. So you see that the CRC is somewhat more lenient than the Star K, but many liquid deodorants, hair mousse, hairsprays, perfumes, colognes, and shaving lotions contain denatured alcohol, and therefore should not be used on Pesach unless they are listed as chametz-free on a reliable list of Pesach products. And I think, Archie, the reason why the CRC is so lenient with deodorants, even if it has denatured alcohols, there's no way to reconstitute it. No, he's saying it's once it's a solid, forget about it. Just totally forget about it. There's no way to renature that alcohol. It's not feasible. Whatever you're going to get out of there is.
I just wanted to say they wouldn't use denatured alcohol to make a lotion. They use pure stuff.
Okay.
I used to make a compound a lot.
Okay. But he says lipstick, mouthwash, and toothpaste which contain chametz should not be used because once again you're putting them in your mouth even if they're nifsal me'achilas kelev. Okay.
The way you take the feminine CRC case, how does your take such a hard line?
They're different. It's really slight nuances of chumrah. It's clearly acknowledged by Kor and by the Star K that you can be makel. There's no reason, but you saw it. The whole shiur was about the reasons to be machmir, right? You saw the reasons to be machmir. That something that can be reconstituted is still could potentially present a problem. Something like from the Sholem Eshiv that's manufactured initially for the purposes of not eating could also still be aser b'hana. So, in other words, you have reasons. Do we paskin like that? According to many poskim, no reason to be machmir, but nevertheless.
You have all the lists. The list itself
So,
is the
so
problem.
I'm going to tell you, in my career experience, I've encountered people who are inappropriately machmir, but I've also encountered people who are inappropriately mekor. Not even around Pesach. For example, a woman has an iron deficiency. She needs to take an iron supplement. There are many, many iron supplements that are available that do not contain blood in them. But a very, very common and inexpensive iron supplement is to take animal blood product, put it in a capsule, and have a woman consume that. But there are many other sources of iron, and yet some people say, well, I need it, my doctor says I need it, not even going to give it a second thought. There are other people who are diabetics, right, or really have a life-threatening condition, and on the other end, they're meshuggah, because they don't listen to reason, and they won't take their medication on Yom Kippur. They'll fast on fast days when they shouldn't be fasting. They'll do crazy things. So you do have both extremes. Religion is a dangerous thing. It's if a person. The reason the lists were compiled initially was for people who would be sensible and would be able to speak to a Rav first and say, look, this medication has a viable substitute which contains nothing non-kosher. It does the exact same thing. If you as my physician feel that it is perfectly acceptable to substitute this for that, may I use this instead? That's really what it's for. And the same thing would be for Pesach.
One could see that in supplements and all these, but there's medications that are anti-hyper for blood pressure and so on and so forth. Really,
And it's also extremely unlikely, by the way, that there's going to be any issues of chametz in those kinds of medications to begin with. Yeah. Okay. No, I hear you. I hear you, Lazer. Okay. Let's stop in Meyer.